We are.
Well, welcome, Legacy Bible Church. And I'm so glad to be back with Sarah. We're back with Live and Unscripted. It's been many months, and I have missed doing Live and Unscripted. And just to give a little refresher to the people in our audience, Live and Unscripted is about boots on the ground.
Mhm.
And you make it that way because this is really about what you want to talk about. Sarah, you come to these Live and Unscripteds every week with something you want to talk about. And what I love about it is you always make it so practical. It's always boots on the ground. How do you walk out this faith that God has given us?
That's
and
a good way.
I love that. I love that about the discussions we have, and I'm glad to be back.
Well, I love that you allow me to bring these, that you don't shut it down and keep it into a level that people can't reach, but I can say, hey, let's just get and ask these questions. So I appreciate that you give the opportunity for it. And so we are so excited to be back and doing this. This is something we've been talking about over and over. We need to get back to doing it because we don't say we need to because we feel some obligation, but because we love getting on here and bringing perspective, bringing light to what the New Testament authors intended and helping straighten out some bad teaching and bad theology that many of us have had over the years. So we love being here. We love getting back behind the camera and talking to anyone that listens to Legacy Bible Church.
And when you say to straighten out bad teaching, bad theology, we hope that doesn't sound arrogant. And I know Sarah didn't mean it that way. But I want to just reinforce that we do believe God has given us a ministry at Legacy Bible Church of restoration.
Yes.
This is not new. This is restoring what the New Testament authors intended when they wrote. And that's the ministry we have. And if you listen to my teachings on Sunday, you know that I'm deep into the text, word by word, phrase by phrase, walking through the text. We finished a year to get through the book of James, and we're now into the book of Romans. It's probably going to take 2 years. And our ministry is about the text. What did the original authors mean? And we are cutting, and you'll hear me talk about it every week. We are cutting through a lot of bad teaching and bad tradition that has existed in the church. That's the ministry God's given us.
But not adding, not making up our own things, not saying something that's not there. We're getting back to the New Testament. Some of the things that you might have questioned, well, why does one person say that and someone says that, and how are we going to attain this? We're getting back to the truest meaning of what the authors had intended. So yes, we're not saying that bad teaching and bad theology to sound arrogant in any way. It's
but
just
it's
the
true.
Simple facts of what we do.
It's only arrogant if it's not true.
It's true. And this is true. So we're back after we're thinking that it's probably been close to 6 months since we've gotten behind the camera and talked to all of you guys that listen. And so we were talking about, we're so excited to get back. What are we going to talk about? Is it necessary to even say while we've been off? And while it might not be necessary, I think it's very important to the ministry of Legacy Bible Church as to why we took a break, because Stephen was deep into studies and writings and readings. And so first we thought we'd talk about sabbatical and what a sabbatical means, what it looks like. Then we kind of just shortened it to Sabbath because that's where you get sabbatical. And so we're just going to jump in there. Kind of just, why don't you, Stephen, tell us what's been going on the past 6 months?
Well, 6 months ago, I began my final research seminar in my PhD studies, and been involved in that now for about 4.5 years, formally for about 4.5 years of very intense reading and research and writing at a PhD level for a formal seminary PhD program. And the past 6 months has been the final research seminar of that long run. And it was on the Synoptic Gospels, and which is an area that I was very excited to get into because it is a structured opportunity, and I say that in the sense that without the discipline of a formal research seminars, it would be very difficult, if not even impossible, to really set aside the time and put in the effort necessary that you have to for a research seminar. So I was so excited to do this for the Synoptic Gospels, where you really, in a very disciplined way with a lot of accountability, study the Synoptic Gospels as separate literary. I'm talking about by Synoptic Gospels, for those of you that aren't familiar with the term, that simply means Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they're called Synoptic Gospels because they're so similar, and but they're not the same. And so this seminar, this research seminar, allowed me the opportunity to study Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side, making comparisons and really developing a thought, a reason on why do they vary the way they do? Why does which came first, which was second, who wrote third, and why? Assuming, of course, one of my assumptions is that the Gospels were written early, and meaning in no later than the early 60s of the first century. And my assumption is that they knew each other. Mark wrote first, Matthew wrote second, and he knew of Mark, and in fact structured his gospel. Matthew structured his gospel after the same structure that Mark used. And then Luke wrote third and structured his with knowledge of both Matthew and Mark. And so with those assumptions, which I think are I won't go into the details of them here, but you can then begin to, through the lens of that assumption, begin to analyze why Matthew wrote the way he did in light of Mark, and why Luke wrote the way he did in light of Matthew and Mark. And so it left little time for
and that's what you were
else.
doing. You were looking into all of those, and that's why it was super deep.
That's been the emphasis in my world for the last 6 months, and so I'm just so thankful that that's completed now.
And so to tie it into a sabbatical or Sabbath, Sabbath, most people know it's a day of rest. That's all we know. They know sabbatical. They'll hear pastors say sabbatical. When I first heard, I never knew that it was tied to like universities and professors. I always just heard pastor sabbatical, go on their cruise, go on their vacation. How would you tie Sabbath, the time of rest? Because what you just discussed does not sound very restful. I mean, it was definitely learning. You were pursuing. Yeah. So how would you tie that in? Is there?
In terms of an academic meaning of sabbatical, that's a figurative meaning. Obviously, piggybacking on the literal meaning of Sabbath, that is from the Bible, from the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so in the academic world, they use the term sabbatical as a figurative meaning from the biblical term that just basically says you rest from your normal routine. And in the academic world, when a professor gets a sabbatical, he's not going to the movies or going on a cruise. He uses his sabbatical from his normal routine to be able to do intense study and writing. Typically is what a sabbatical is for, is that a professor can really dive into a season of research and study that he might not otherwise with his regular duties at school be able to do. And so a sabbatical is not easy. Most professors will tell you a sabbatical is not a season of rest per se, but it's a season of hard work, resting away from the normal routine. That's a sabbatical in the academic sense. And of course, that's figurative.
That doesn't really go with what we always think of Sabbath.
Yeah. You think
so I guess Sabbath would, when God took his seventh day, he rested. And I guess we always think rest means you're not doing anything. He just rested from what he was doing.
He rested from his creative work.
Yeah. He just took it.
I mean, Genesis is very clear on that God made the creation in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested.
This is a good time to point out what we were trying to say at the very beginning, that this is why I feel Legacy Bible Church and the work that we do is so important, because you take just a word like this, Sabbath or sabbatical. So let's just stay with Sabbath. And I've always heard Sabbath is, you do have your Seventh-day Adventists that do it on Saturday, but for the most part, Sunday is your Sabbath day. I've heard lots and lots of pastors say, we need to get back to the Sabbath. That means Sunday, take your day of rest. You go to church, you come home, and you just rest. You do nothing. Okay, so that's how I've always heard Sabbath. But now listening to Stephen, I'm thinking I'm thinking about all he's saying, and it's not just a day to be lazy. It's just a day to take a break from your normal work.
And we certainly wouldn't call God lazy.
Right.
He rested from. So let me give you a couple of perspectives.
Let me say real quick. So this is my whole point to that was, this is where Legacy Bible Church comes in. It's like, okay, this is how you've always been taught, but I don't think that it means what they've always thought it means. Let's get back to what the Bible means, what the authors are portraying correctly.
Biblical perspective.
Okay, so give us some. Yeah. You said you're going to give some perspective.
Well, the first Sabbath, God rested from his work in creating.
Yes.
On the seventh day. And the Sabbath is part of the Ten Commandments, right? Under the Mosaic law, the Israelites were required on the seventh day of their week, which would be our Saturday. Keep in mind, Israelites went from evening to evening. Their days began and ended with sunset, not like in the Western world with sunrise, but the days begin and end with sunset. So by the Mosaic law, the Israelites were required to not do work on the seventh day and not to engage in frivolity and have fun, but to focus entirely on God. Their Sabbath, rest from their 6 days of work and, farming or whatever they did. The seventh day was not to do nothing and not to go have fun, but to be entirely absorbed in one thing, and that is to focus on God, study Torah, and do things that would be oriented toward their covenant relationship with God, who God is, what he did for them, and continues to do for them. And Sabbath is about one thing. It's about God. That's the Sabbath under the Mosaic law. And then, if I can use Mark, Sarah and I have talked about Mark a little bit here in the last couple of days. With the resurrection, Mark begins, here we are in the Synoptic Gospels. Mark begins in chapter 16 with the resurrection. He makes two references to Sabbath. Only Mark does this. Matthew and Luke make only one reference to Sabbath. But Mark, if you look at Mark 16:1 and gets into 16:2, he makes two references to Sabbath. The first one is he writes that through the happening. It's a compound verb, diagenomai, a fairly rare compound verb. Diagenomai means through the happening. It's a very literal rendering of the verb, and I think a literal rendering is important here. Through the happening of the Sabbath, meaning the Sabbath had just happened, the Jewish Sabbath. Through the happening of the Sabbath was completed. That was entered into what we call Sunday, which would be the third day after the crucifixion. So Mark begins through the happening of the Sabbath. That puts you into the third day after the crucifixion. Through the happening of the Sabbath, the women went out to the empty grave with spices to anoint the body of Jesus. And so that Sabbath has, I'm going to say it has two levels of meaning here in the Markan author's mind. It obviously had the surface level meaning of the Jewish Sabbath according to the law of Moses, that the Sabbath had passed. And so the women could now engage in work, so to speak. They could go out to the empty grave with spices to anoint the body and not violate the Jewish Sabbath. That's a surface level meaning. And one thing is very characteristic of ancient Jewish literature is that they very often, especially in literature like a gospel, a Jewish writer would write on two levels. He would write a very obvious surface meaning, and he would have a very not figurative, but a more important meaning beneath the surface, a secondary meaning that was actually his primary meaning. And I would suggest to you that the Sabbath that the Markan author refers to there through the happening of the Sabbath would refer to all the way back to Genesis, God's rest from creation. Through the happening of the Sabbath, then Mark refers, now that's a singular also, through the happening of the Sabbath. Sabbath is singular. He refers also, do you want to read it, where Mark refers a second time to the Sabbath?
What is it, 16?
It might be in 16:2.
Okay.
Does it say Sabbath? It might say week.
Okay,
If it
so we
says
have,
week,
yep.
If it says week, the Greek word is the plural of Sabbath. Gets translated into English as week.
So should I change that in mine to Sabbath?
I would call it Sabbath week, just so you know that the word in the Greek, they don't have a word for week. And they use the word Sabbath in the plural as meaning week.
So this is what we have. Matthew 16:1 and Mark 16:1.
By the way, in Star Ross, the Wooden Bible, I've added Sabbath to that, called the second one. Sabbath
and also you had elapsing, and now you said, what did you say at the beginning? You said the happening.
Through the happening.
So I'm reading from Stauros. I'm going to read Mark 16:1. And out of the, do you want me to say happening?
You say through the happening.
And through the happening of the Sabbath, Mary the Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and is this Salome? Salome brought spices in order that after they might anoint him. And very early on the first day of
the Sabbath
day of the Sabbath week, they came to the grave during the rising of the sun.
Okay, stop there. And so here's the I think the more important meaning on that first level of Sabbath is that God rested from his creative work on the seventh day. And we're now into the proverbial eighth day. And the meaning there is God is entering again into creative work. And the creative activity, creative working of God is reinitiated in this new covenant age.
Oh.
And what is he creating?
It ended.
It ended a long season going all the way back to the first 6 days of creation. God rested on the seventh day. And we're now into the last, what the fourth evangelist, John, frequently refers to as the last days. And these are the last days. This is what the Markan author refers to as with the plural Sabbath, when he says that they came out very early on the Sabbath week with the rising of the sun. This is all figurative, pointing to the eighth day. It's a new day of creation. It's the new covenant age. And the plural Sabbath on, again, surface level is going to refer to a new day of a week. That was Sunday in Western terms. Sunday, first day of the week, a new week. Always, not always, but often the Jewish author has a secondary, much more important meaning beneath the surface that he wants you to see. And in this case, the Sabbath, where God has entered into a new age of creation, where he is once again creating, and that's signaled by the first use of Sabbath through the happening of the Sabbath. That means that Sabbath, that rest of God from his creative work has passed, it's ended. we're now into an 8th day. And that also keys to Jesus, by the way, in chapter 7 of John, where on the great day of the feast, which would be the Feast of Booths, that's the 8th day of the Feast of Booths, Jesus stood among the people of Jerusalem and said, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me, and rivers of living water will flow forth from his womb. This is a new day of creation that Jesus is foretelling there on the 8th day of the Feast of Booths. And so the second use of the word Sabbath, which is in the plural, is referring to the same thing that Jesus referred to in Luke recorded in Acts 1, where Jesus referred to no one knows the times or the seasons that the kingdom of God comes except the Father. Times and seasons, that's plural. And so likewise with the Sabbath plural in the second use, where it has the surface meaning of Sabbath week, is referring to those times and seasons when a new covenant, new creation, right? A believer in Jesus Christ is a new creation. When God sends the Spirit and plants faith into the heart of a believer, that believer is a new creation. That's the reigniting of the creative activity of God in this new age of the new covenant. This is a new season. The age of God's Sabbath rest on the 7th day has ended. We're now into an 8th day, which is a new day of creation for God, representing the new covenant age. And God's works, the Father's works, are new covenant redeemed believers in Jesus Christ. We are new creations through the faith which is from Jesus Christ. It's planted into the heart of a human being, where they recognize that they are now clean from their sins. They have been cleansed from their sins by the working of Jesus Christ on the cross, and the faith that the Father sending the Spirit as the sower plants that Logos word of life into the heart of a human being. They're a new creation. This is a new season of creation, that God is creating a new people. And so that's the meaning, getting back to Sabbath. That's the plural meaning of Sabbath, is referring to that iterative, if for those whom God has made a new creation, that's a positional reality. We're a child of God. That'll never change. That's just a function of faith. We have faith to believe. We're a child of God. That's an eternal reality. No one can ever take that away. I can't even abdicate it. I can go sit on my rear end and not do anything, but I can never abdicate my status as a child of God through the faith which is from Jesus Christ. That's a creative work of God, and that's an eternal reality. But we then have a choice, an option as children of God, and an invitation, if you will, to participate with God in this season of creation. And so the plural that's used the second time by Mark, that on the surface just means a new week, 7-day week that we've entered into. The plural has reference to this iterative times and seasons when the children of God, who through the faith have positional status as children of God, we can participate in a functional manner with God in his creative activity through our taking a Sabbath rest. And the Sabbath rest that we take, God's working. He's not having a Sabbath rest in the 7th day. The Sabbath rest, plural, that is Mark's more important meaning in that second use, are those times and seasons when the children of the new covenant, redeemed children of God who have positional status as a child of God, can participate with God in his creative activity. But to do that, we have to rest. We have to die to self. We have to die to self, according to what Paul calls the obedience from faith, and enter into that spiritual union with Jesus Christ where he's speaking from the throne, and we become his voice on the earth, where his things he speaks from the throne are released into the creation through the voices of subjected children of God. That's a functional realm of participating with God in his creative activity in this new season of creating. And what's he creating?
New believers.
A new people of God.
And that's a Sabbath when that is Sabbath when
That's Sabbath.
You're dying to yourself, you're putting your mind aside, you're resting from your usual thoughts and goings and everything, and you're speaking forth.
That is the new covenant Sabbath.
Okay, so that was wonderful. So here's all the notes I've been making. And when I was listening to you talk, anyone who has listened to Stephen share in Legacy Bible Church, he always says, when Jesus came, died and rose again, the law of Moses, you always say sunset Moses to the side, the law. And now the new covenant is ushered in with the near and in purpose. So when I'm reading that and hearing you talk, that's all I could think about. The elapsing of the Sabbath, Moses was sunsetted, and then ushered in with a new week, the new covenant, where we participate in the in purpose. Like that whole thing.
The Sabbath is no longer Saturday or Sunday, whatever you call it.
It's no longer a day.
New covenant Sabbath can happen anytime, any day, whenever a new covenant believer will die to self. That's the Sabbath. And there can be multiple Sabbaths per day, multiple events of dying to self and entering into that spiritual union with Jesus Christ. It's not God's Sabbath. We're the ones taking a Sabbath when we die to self. That's the new covenant Sabbath. And
when you're thinking about the old covenant with Sabbath, where the Israelites rested on the seventh day to intensely study and focus on God, is the notes I made. If they're taking a break from their work, their hard physical labor, it does seem like God was building in a time of rest for them. And so when we participate in the in purpose and we participate in that Sabbath rest, you do walk away rejuvenated. You do walk away. It's like sometimes when your mind is so full and you can't, and I know you've experienced that probably many times in the past 6 months, when your mind is full and you can't figure everything out and you need to be reordered and you need to be refreshed, you take a deep breath and you speak in tongues, you worship.
Isn't that easy?
And you're just refreshed.
Yeah. And that's exactly, by the way, church, when Jesus said, "My yoke is easy." That's exactly what Jesus was meaning, is that when we will die to self and enter into that spiritual union with him, we take on his yoke and we can just rest from our busy, chaotic minds and let the mind of Christ operate through our organs of speech. There's nothing easier, and knowing that we're participating with God in his creative working in the perfect will of the Father.
So I put in our title that we were going to talk about Sabbath, where we've been and where we're going. So we talked about where we've been, that it was a really intense season for Stephen to study.
Away from the normal
grind of every day. It was just an intense season of studying. Then we've talked about what Sabbath is, what it's the examples we've seen in the Bible, and what it is now for the new covenant believers to participate with the in purpose. And then I wanted to going forward for the next weeks when we come, that what we want to do, where we've been, where we're going. Where we're going is to bring fresh insight on the New Testament authors' purpose when they were writing. And so join us back. We try to come every Tuesday, and Sundays are wonderful too. But what you just heard about the Sabbath and where we try to show you restore, what we want to do is let you hear that what Jesus said, "My yoke is easy, my burden is light." We don't want here at Legacy Bible Church to make anything more difficult. Is the New Testament somewhat difficult to understand? Sure. Paul wrote deep, John wrote deep, all of them wrote deep. It's a lot. There's so much meaning. Hard to understand. It is. There is so much meaning packed. I mean, if Peter walked with all of these guys, walked with Jesus and still said, "Look, Peter or Paul can be a little difficult," then we can say it's a little difficult. But what we do is we dive in. We bring to you Sabbath, for instance. You might hear from many of the mainstream churches, Sabbath is when you, on Sundays, you do nothing. You sit, you got to make sure you have your Sabbath or you won't be blessed. God commanded to have a Sabbath. You need one day of rest, whether that's Sunday, whether that's just one of your days off. You have to have a Sabbath. Or, you hear those things. What we're trying to do is restore some of those words to their meaning, especially now in the new covenant. So Sabbath for us, a fresh insight going forward, is when you open your mouth and pray in the Spirit, when you put aside your mind. And that's what going forward, you'll hear more of us, just a fresh insight on maybe verses you've always heard, or just stuff that might have been a little twisted, that we're bringing it back to the root of what the New Testament authors intended. And we're always open to any questions that you have about Sabbath. That's something, even though I've been listening to Stephen for so long, just sitting and listening to him today, reading Mark 16:1, I'm like, again, sunset Moses, usher in the new covenant. Now we participate. And so there's always new revelation, not new revelation, because that sounds like we're bringing something in, new insight.
This is a restoration.
Yeah, new restoration. Yeah. There's always restoration where you're
Yeah.
like, oh, that's what that meant. The whole time it was sitting there. That's what Jesus meant when he said, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. That we're to have, can have a Sabbath every single day, many times throughout the day. We're not just waiting for one day of the week. So that's what we try to do here at Legacy Bible Church. And I hope that what you just heard from Stephen, just sharing where he's dove into the New Testament, to the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, like he's never has before. I could say that you've never been as deep as you have been.
I haven't.
To bring forth more, there's very much more exciting teaching to come from what he's learned. And we hope that you go forward understanding Sabbath a little bit better.
Yeah.
I
think that's good.
Let's kind of sum it up, what we want to do.
And by the way, I'm looking forward to renewed time together most weeks to have these chat times.
And will you say in a better way, because I do not want anyone to walk away thinking I'm saying we have a new revelation.
Oh my gosh! Yeah.
Please clarify.
No, I think you've clarified it, but let's finish on that note.
Yeah.
This is nothing new here at Legacy Bible Church. What we teach goes all the way back to what I'm going to just quote Irenaeus. Irenaeus was a church father. He was a bishop of the church at Lyon in modern southern France in the late 2nd century. He was an advocate of the original tradition of the apostles, and he referred in his writings to the ancient tradition of the apostles. And that contrasts with what he would have called, or what he did call, the tradition practiced and championed by the church at Rome and most of the churches as he called it an apostolical tradition, because there was a certain degree of apostolic stewarding that brought that Judaized tradition to Rome and was spread. And so Irenaeus, in his writings in the late 2nd century, a revered church father, recognized two different traditions. One was what he called the apostolical tradition practiced by the churches championed by Rome, and the other he called the ancient tradition of the apostles. And he specifically said that the apostolical tradition practiced by the churches of Rome was a latter tradition that emerged after what he called the ancient tradition of the apostles. And so when we say we are a restorative ministry, we are restoring the meaning of the scriptures back to the ancient, what Irenaeus called the ancient tradition of the apostles. Nothing new.
Nothing new.
Yeah, entirely restoration. And that's our ministry at Legacy Bible Church.
Absolutely. And we're so excited to get back and meet again next Tuesday. I have a list of things. I typically have a list of things I want to talk about, and then sometimes I get distracted and go on to another list. But I have many things I want to talk about. But if there's anything that any one of our listeners want to talk about, and it's something that you're confused on, something you just might have had questions, something maybe you've always been too scared to talk to another pastor about, email. We've got it down at the bottom of the screen.
We love to talk. We love to hear from you, and nothing's off the table, by the way.
Ever.
There's no such thing as the only bad question is the question you don't ask. And so questions, comments, let's talk.
Yes.
All right. Well, we love you, church, and look forward to being back with you again, and be blessed. Thank you.